If you watch the most recent CNN Democratic debate, you'll agree with me that it was absolutely terrible. Probably the worst, certainly in my opinion, the worst Democratic debate that we've seen this cycle, and definitely ranks among the worst debates that I've ever seen in my entire life for a whole host of reasons. In fact, I was initially gonna, make a whole bunch of videos about the debate. I had recorded it and I was ready to, chop it up and make a bunch of different videos about the debate. But then, I watched it and it was so terrible. And then when I sat down to record, I realized that it was just basically a list of me complaining about things. And so I was like, not really any point in making a video about that. But the one interesting thing which sort of did come out of the debate was that Bernie Warren spat at the very end of the debate, which, we later got audio for. And believe it or not, Tucker Carlson probably had one of the best takes in all of the mainstream media when it comes to this spat. So that's a surprise to see that over on Fox News. It is Fox News, it is Tucker Carlson. There are things that you're not going to agree with in the clip. But overall, in terms of Fox News, and actually just in terms of the mainstream media in general, this is probably the best clip covering the spat. Believe it or not, watch the clip and judge for yourself. So I want to show you that clip. But then when we come back, and I'll talk about the clip for a little bit. But then when we come back, I want to ask an interesting question. I want to ask whether or not, in the long run, CNN will, bow to Bernie Sanders if we see Bernie Sanders running away with the nomination or he wins the nomination. Because you'll remember, initially Fox News was a little bit more critical of Donald Trump than he is now. But then when Donald Trump's popularity really started to rise, when Donald Trump, it was clear he was going to win the nomination, Fox News really just bowed to Donald Trump and really just became Donald Trump's propaganda machine. Will CNN bow to Bernie Sanders? That is a question to be asked. But for now, here's the clip of Tucker Carlson.
Now, at this point, as of right now, there's a strong chance that nominee will be Bernie Sanders. If that happens, if Sanders becomes the official leader of the Democratic Party, all of these people demand to know one thing. How'd this happen? How did Bernie Sanders become the Democratic nominee? And that's a good question. Here's part of the answer. It all started last night at the Democratic debate in Des Moines, when CNN President Jeff Zucker decided to destroy the Sanders for President campaign. Now, Zucker poses as a television executive, but he operates like a political consultant. His latest client is the Democratic establishment, which has dispatched him to crush Bernie Sanders before he can take control of the party. So just before last night's debate, CNN ran a story claiming, without any proof at all, that Bernie Sanders had once told Elizabeth Warren that a woman could not be president. Sanders denied that charge vigorously, but the message was unmistakable and crystal clear. He's a sexist. Don't vote for him. CNN relentlessly hyped the allegations on air, and then once again during the debate. Watch how Zucker's hand-selected moderator framed the story.
Senator Sanders, I do want to be clear here. You're saying that you never told Senator Warren that a woman could not win the election.
That is correct.
Senator Warren, what did you think when Senator Sanders told you a woman could not win the election?
I disagreed.
Senator Warren, what did you think when Senator Sanders told you a woman could not win the election? Which he clearly did, because he's old and hates women and also lies a lot. Just more journalism from our friends on cable news. Suddenly, in weed-scented apartments around Brooklyn and the Bay Area, legions of Bernie supporters understood for the very first time why Donald Trump is always attacking CNN. Why? Because CNN deserves it. And thousands of them reached for their credit cards in response. By this morning, the Sanders campaign was reporting its best ever fundraising on a debate day, with more than 100,000 individual donations. So it turns out it's possible to level attacks that are so stupid and so unfair that they wind up helping the person you're trying to hurt. That's a lesson CNN has repeatedly failed to learn in the Trump era, and they were no smarter this time. From within Jeff Zucker's dark and airless bubble, everything seemed to be going precisely according to plan.
Sanders, look, a lot of it's personal preference. I didn't think his answer vis-a-vis Elizabeth Warren and what was said in that conversation was particularly good. He was largely dismissive. Well, I didn't say it. Everybody knows I didn't say it. We don't need to talk about it.
And I think what Bernie forgot was that this isn't a he said, she said story. This is a reported out story that CNN was part of breaking. So to have him just flat out say no, I think wasn't nearly enough to address that for the women watching.
And I can't imagine any woman watching last night and saying, I believe Bernie.
I think people believe Elizabeth.
This was Elizabeth Warren's night. She needed to do something. And there was a banana peel sitting out there for Bernie to step on when it came to his comments about women. I think Bernie stepped on it and slid around. She knocked that moment out of the park.
Oh, CNN. It's a world where buffoonish old Joe Lockhart, mustard stains on his shirt, is suddenly a renowned expert on what women really want. Hilarious. Ask his first wife. But no one in Zuckerland thought it was funny at all. They had their orders. They proceeded to carry them out with grim determination. Onward to battle! Bernie must be stopped! It almost seemed personal, and in some ways it was personal. Just 4 days ago, CNN settled a lawsuit with its unionized employees for a record $76 million. It was the single largest payout ever collected in the 84-year history of the National Labor Relations Board. When that deal was announced, Bernie Sanders issued a statement celebrating the win for CNN's oppressed and miserable workforce. And they are, trust me. Quote, "Congratulations to the communication workers of America for this victory. This is the result of the union fighting for years to get these workers the justice they deserve." End quote. Jeff Zucker was not amused by that. He readied his troops for battle. But in the end, it didn't work. And by the way, it won't work. Americans may dislike politicians, but they hate the media more. If forced to choose between Bernie Sanders and CNN, most people will go with Bernie.
You know, really the reason why I didn't want to make a kind of separate video talking about this whole Bernie Warren spat is that, you know, it's really, it's a he said, she said kind of thing. And it's kind of like, whose credibility do you trust more? Do you trust more the credibility of the senator who has been fighting for this stuff his entire career and who overall has been fighting for this stuff his entire life? Or do you trust the credibility of someone who lied about her ancestry and who most likely lied about being fired for being pregnant, and who, by the way, a lot of people who know her admit that, yeah, she is kind of known to sort of tell up stories and to kind of, you know, exaggerate, stretch things a little bit. I mean, as far as I can tell, it's a no-brainer. I mean, really, as soon as this stuff was coming out, I was like, she's on, you know, my take on it was, I think she's just making this up. I don't think there's anything to this. But there were a few people, a few progressives who I would even consider to, you know, sort of be good faith. A few people were saying, well, I think she's at least being honest in what she thinks he said. Obviously, he didn't say anything like this. In fact, here's a clip of Bernie Sanders talking about this very thing 30 years ago.
The real issue is not whether you're black or white, whether you're a woman or a man. In my view, a woman could be elected president of the United States. The real issue is, whose side are you on?
I mean, Bernie Sanders has been talking about this stuff, you know, his entire life, and this isn't something which he would say, but there were some progressives who thought, well, you know, she might have thought that that's what he said. But, you know, as far as I can tell, as far as how I see it is, that doesn't actually matter because she still stabbed him in the back, right? Because obviously whatever she thought that he said, she didn't think that it was a big enough deal to either talk to him about it before, or to talk about the media, or excuse me, to talk to the media about it sooner. Instead, she waited all this time to talk about it. So as far as I can tell, you know, she's still stabbing him in the back, and she's just as bad, just as deceptive, even if she actually thinks that that's what, you know, if that's what she said, or if that's what he said. So, I mean, it's, I mean, this whole thing really, you know, Elizabeth Warren really used to be more or less my second choice. I mean, maybe like a Gabbard or a Yang would have technically been my second choice, but my second choice in terms of the candidates who had any kind of, you know, who I thought were maybe more viable, I was thinking to myself, you know, Warren's probably my second choice in that sense. A distant second, to be sure, a distant second from Bernie Sanders, but, you know, a second choice indeed. But honestly, after this kind of serious deception and the fact that she's really staffing her campaign with a bunch of kind of former Clinton, former Obama people, really just makes me very skeptical of her, of not just her campaign now, but her candidacy and herself in general. And, you know, the whole thing about unity, by the way, like we're always told, I remember initially there were a lot of progressives who were kind of making sort of criticisms and clear distinctions between Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. And there were a lot of people who I would call kind of establishment progressives in a sense, who, you know, might be to the left on the issues, kind of, but then have like a real clear establishment bent. I mean, there are a lot of those people who were like, hey, look, you can't even come out and try to make distinction on this because unity, 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 and you're going to ultimately hurt the progressive movement. And, you know, I mean, but where are those people now? I don't see these establishment progressives trying to now criticize Elizabeth Warren for coming out with this ridiculous, clearly hatched up move. And I think part of this is, you know, the establishment has a clear bent for kind of Democratic Democratic strategists who, look, one of the criticisms which you can make about a lot of Democratic strategy, and actually not just Democratic strategy in general, but media strategists as a whole. And I remember studying this in school and studying sort of political strategy and being very skeptical of a lot of the maneuvers which they make, because one of the things which they'll try to do is a good Democratic strategist, or excuse me, just a good political strategist in general, will try to spin things in the media. Will try to, you know, create a story or do something which is going to be spun and played a certain way in the media. And that is useful. That's good. But those stories which have to be spun in a very peculiar way. And the reason for that is, especially now, the media is wildly unpopular. I mean, the reason why Donald Trump is able to criticize the media effectively is, I mean, well, one of the reasons is, look, Donald Trump is actually more popular than the media, right? Donald Trump is an unpopular president, but who's less popular? The media, right? And so people are skeptical of the media, and they're skeptical of the media in certain kinds of ways. They're skeptical of the media in terms of being sort of in bed with moneyed interest and being kind of obsessed with certain kind of vanity projects of identity. Now, look, I mean, identity does matter in certain respects. I'm not denying that, but there is some serious criticisms which can be made about how identity politics is played out in the media. And I think that, you know, that's one area where people can be sort of really, really critical. Now, at the end of that clip from Tucker Carlson, he says, look, if it's going to be a fight between the media and a fight between Bernie Sanders is absolutely going to win. And, you know, there's a lot of good evidence for that. In fact, let me show you a poll real quick. So this is a Reuters Ipsos poll. It's the most recent Reuters Ipsos poll. It was taken entirely post-debate. And it shows, as you can see here, Bernie Sanders up at 20% with Joe Biden at 19%. Now, this is a +2 gain for Bernie Sanders relative to the last poll. And again, this poll was taken entirely after the debate. So it does seem like Bernie Sanders is going up a little bit. Now, when it comes to these Reuters Ipsos polls, the reason why Joe Biden is so far behind is because they give you... they give voters the option of saying, hey, I don't know yet. I don't know for sure yet. Whereas a lot of other polls, they kind of make someone pick. And a lot of those people who aren't quite sure yet will kind of just say, well, look, I'm going with Joe Biden. And I do think, by the way, there is merit to asking, you know, kind of both types of questions, because we want data on, we want data on both sides. But I think that does suggest that there's possibly a kind of crack in Joe Biden's support, or a potential crack in Joe Biden's support, where it can be shattered with winning those early states in Iowa, New Hampshire, etc. And that's why it's so critical for Bernie Sanders to win those early states. And so that's why, you know, when it comes to whether or not this is going to help him, I think it does seem like it is helping him. I mean, he got something like $4 million in donations after it, and like 100,000 contributions or something crazy like this, or something crazy like that after the debate. So it does seem like it's helping him, but that doesn't mean that it's the kind of gamble which you want to play with, right? So even though it seems like this is going to help him, and I remember as soon as these stories were coming out, I was immediately like, this is going to help him, because, you know, even though the media is going to spin it and it's going to give the exact spin that, you know, those Democratic strategists that the Warren campaign, you know, hires, that they, you know, it's their media is going to spin it how they want it, but it's the kind of spin which people are inherently going to be skeptical of. So, you know, I was immediately like, this is going to help Bernie, but it's still not the kind of gamble which you would want, because since it's so important for Bernie Sanders to win those early states, and he is well positioned to do it right now, you don't really want to like gamble, if that makes sense. So even if there's only like a 5% chance that it does hurt Bernie Sanders, it's not something what you want to gamble with, because that's still like essentially a 5% chance of a knockout. Because if Bernie Sanders doesn't win those early states, Joe Biden is ahead overall nationally, and so if he doesn't win those early states, it's going to be really, really tough for Bernie Sanders to catch up. So it's again, even if it's like a 5% chance, it's like a 5% chance of basically a knockout. So that's not like a gamble you'd want to play, even though it's almost certain that it is something that's going to help him, if that makes sense. I hope that makes sense. But anyway, I said at the beginning that I wanted to talk a little bit about whether or not I thought CNN ultimately one day would bow to Bernie Sanders in the same way that Fox News bowed to Donald Trump. Because you'll remember at the beginning, kind of Rupert Murdoch, at one of the early Republican debates, Rupert Murdoch had sent down word to one of the debates, like the moderators, to be really critical of Donald Trump, like, let's stop him now. And we had that whole back and forth with Megyn Kelly, where Donald Trump told Megyn Kelly that she had blood coming out of her wherever, et cetera, et cetera. And we had that sort of now infamous back and forth. And so the question then is still like, well, is CNN going to bow in the same way that Fox News bowed to Donald Trump? Well, yes and no. I think, look, if Bernie Sanders outright wins the nomination, I think to some extent in the general election, now after the election, I think that, that's up in the air. But in the general election, I do think the media will probably be very critical of Donald Trump. There are a lot of journalists, some of whom I actually know, who were personally insulted by Donald Trump, and who now absolutely, absolutely hate the guy. So, we can look at it kind of from a distance vantage point and see Donald Trump insulting the media and insulting journalists and be like, and have a kind of different feeling about it. But like, think about it like in their shoes, actually being insulted by Donald Trump. And like I said, I actually know some of these people who, now they just hate the guy genuinely in their heart. Obviously, they want to try to be, they want to try to be objective, but they hate the guy. So I actually do think that genuinely will play a role. If Bernie Sanders wins the nomination, they're going to back the Democrat. A lot of the people in the mainstream media will just back the Democratic candidate to an extent. Now, not necessarily on policy, to be clear, because they don't agree with him on policy. I mean, the whole thing with the union where, there was a massive, like $70-something million payout, part of CNN, the like CNN union or whatever, CNN had to do basically a massive payout, and so CNN doesn't like the fact that Bernie Sanders is out here backing the union. So, when it comes to policy, not necessarily, but when it comes to criticizing Donald Trump, I think they will. Now, I don't think that they're going to bow very easily, though, because just the breakdown is quite different. Like in Fox News, you have a very old audience, and a lot of the people supporting Donald Trump are, they're older, right? Whereas the case of CNN, they also have an old audience, although to be fair, not as old. I think CNN's average like daytime viewership is like 59, and then I think, let's see, yeah, so it's 61 for primetime, and then so both MSNBC then and Fox News have 66 for primetime and 65 for daytime. So both MSNBC and Fox News are older than CNN, so CNN is a little bit younger, but still 50, 59, and 61 are still pretty old, at least at least compared to me. One day, hopefully, I'll get that old, and it won't seem that old. But for now, those numbers do seem really old. And when it comes to Bernie Sanders supporters, really, it's 35 and under who are like very, very hardcore Bernie. So I don't think that you're going to see the kind of backlash where, people would literally just turn off their TVs if they were hearing criticisms of Donald Trump. I mean, you do see it, though, by the way. You do see it, like if you go online, for instance, on Rising, like Hill TV's Rising, you go to any video which is like critical of Bernie Sanders, where there's someone on one of their clips who's like critical of Bernie Sanders or who is like pro-establishment and has like massive dislike ratio, which, by the way, like and dislikes actually do affect the video, so make sure to like this video. But what I'm saying is the audience obviously matters, and when it comes to CNN, they have an older audience. who isn't necessarily super pro Bernie. So even though Bernie Sanders does have like really, really high favorabilities, I don't think that they're going to face the kind of immediate backlash of people just turning off the TV if they're seeing kind of criticisms of Bernie Sanders. But at the same time, I do think that the journalists are very, very critical of Donald Trump. So if Bernie Sanders outright wins the nomination, I think at least in the general election, the journalists will be critical of Donald Trump, but they won't be kind of pro Bernie, if that makes sense. So that's sort of my take on the whole back and forth thing. So anyway, I just wanted to show you that clip from Tucker Carlson and talk a little bit about it. So if you like the video, I'd really appreciate it if you hit the like button and consider subscribing. Thanks.